20 years ago, if you were talking with friends at work and they told you that they were really interested in going out into the woods, and you said, well, why do you go into the woods? And they say, well, is it hiking? No. Is it backpacking? No. Is it hunting, fishing? No. So why do you go into the woods? Well, I like to go into the woods because I'm looking for Bigfoot. Now, you see, 20 years ago, if you had said that, probably your colleagues, your friends, your family, they'd maybe lean back and there would be the eyebrow raised, like, okay, what kind of weirdo are you? But at this point in our culture, for whatever reason, we're very open to this sort of stuff. The U.S. government is openly talking about aliens, and there's about 500 podcasts or shows or video shows on Bigfoot. And there's Bigfoot festivals and merch and gear and events. And I have friends personally who go out into the woods and look for Bigfoot. So what's the shift, Ben? What's going on in our culture? Well, I think we have moved away from a purely materialistic, a purely naturalistic view, and we've become more open to spiritual things, whether those are good or bad. Well, today, we are going to examine one of the most supernaturally speculated passages in the Bible. A Bible verse that when you read it, or if one of your friends or family or co-workers read it, they're going to do the same thing with the Bigfoot. They're going to lean back and they might raise their eyebrow and say, what kind of weirdo are you? So this is going to be a little bit different. So if you would, open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 6. And our title today is The Giant, Mighty, Renowned God of Grace. That whatever we read today in this story, what we know is that the awesomeness, the glory, and the grace of God towers over all of it. Now, as we examine this chapter, we need to be careful, and I don't know if you know this, but the chapters and verse numbers in your English Bible are not a part of Scripture. They're not bad. Those were just added by people to be helpful, and they are helpful. At times, however, they can lead us astray like they will do here in this passage. In our culture, we have chapters, and those chapters mark an introduction to a new section and the end of an old section. But the book of Genesis has what are called toldots. And these toldots do the exact same thing. They are hinges for the story, and as you can see from the graph, there are 11 of them in the book of Genesis. And so from Genesis chapter 5, verse 1 to Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, this is a single toldot. So notice that we have divided the story differently than the author of Genesis has divided it. And so we need to make sure that we're looking at chapter 5, verse 1 to chapter 6, verse 9 as a unit, a completed unit that should be considered together. So last week, as we got into chapter 5, here's what we discovered. There was a summary of the creation. There was a genealogy that connected Adam to Noah. And within that genealogy, there were two special things. There was Enoch, who walked with God and then who was taken out. And then there was a prophecy about a boy who was born who would basically rescue the people and provide relief. And this was Noah. So that's what we've looked at so far. Let's continue the rest of the toldot. Genesis chapter 6, we're just going to read verses 1 to 5. I'm reading from the ESV. This is what the scripture says. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. And these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So here's what we've looked at so far. If we were to summarize this toldot, and again, this is a Hebrew word, and when I say toldot, it's like a chapter. This is what we've got so far. We've got a summary of the creation, the genealogy of Adam to Noah. We have great wickedness on the earth, a decision to flood the earth, and then, of course, Noah finding favor and he and his family being saved. So this is a complete unit within the Hebrew Bible. There's a lot to unpack here, but I think it might be easy if I just give a one-sentence summary of this section, and I would summarize it like this. Since great wickedness was found on the earth, the Lord will flood the earth, but Noah, the descendant of Adam, will be saved and bring relief. So this is it. Well, I want to get into the details of chapter 6, and if you have your Bibles, follow along. In verse 1, the author immediately brings up this idea of multiplication, that human beings are getting married, having children, and multiplying, but he brings this up specifically to tell us that there were many daughters of men, and to use the Bible's phrase or the Bible's word, the earth at this point was filled with attractive women. Now you might say, well, what does the attractiveness of the women have to do with it? Well, it matters because the scripture itself uses that terminology, and because the attractiveness of the women caught the attention of someone or something. The Bible refers to them in verse 2 as sons of God. So the human beings were multiplying across the earth. There were many attractive women, and they caught the attention of the sons of God. And it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives. So the most obvious question is, who are the sons of God? Well, this is a good question, and there are many theories. Let me walk you through three of the primary ones. The first theory is that these sons of God were kingly men or lords. And what was wrong with these kingly men or lords marrying the sons or the daughters of man? Well, if you look at verse 2, it says, they took as their wives any they chose. And so the theory is that you have these powerful, rich, kingly kings, lordly kings, and they took women, they went and took them by force and forced them to be in their harem. And this was a type of polygamy that we saw earlier, and so this was growing, and so these kingly men began kidnapping multiple women from the land and bringing them into their harems. Now, this sounds good, but the problem here is that it says that these unions created the Nephilim, who were giants. And so how is it that kingly men would kidnap women into their harems and then they would end up with giant children? It doesn't make any sense. Also, the phrase, they took their wives, was a common phrase in the old world that was used, and it didn't indicate force. It was just a phrase that was used to find a wife. So I don't think these were kingly men or lords. Another theory is that these sons of God were actually godly men from the line of Seth. And the argument goes like this. 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Lord, referring to David, says this, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And the idea is that the Lord calls upon his own children, his own leaders, godly men and women, as his children. And so the Son of God means godly men. The idea here is that you had godly men from the line of Seth, and what they did wrong is they married ungodly women from the line of Cain. So that's one of the theories here. You have another problem, though. Once again, if you have godly men marrying ungodly women, then how do you have Nephilim as offspring? So it doesn't really fit. Although I will say that Augustine and other early church fathers, some of them took this view, particularly after Augustine's shift away from the Manichaeanism. But anyway, it is somewhat popular because of that. Now, as you might guess, I don't accept the first two because it seems odd to specifically report on taking wives when this has been happening at this point for 1,600 years, unless it was out of the ordinary. And also the Nephilim, these giants as offspring, are not explained. I tend to feel that there is a supernatural bias at work here, meaning anything that is out of the ordinary or supernatural can't really be the answer, so we have to come up with a naturalistic interpretation. Now, the last option in this passage, which makes it controversial, is that when it says the sons of God came and took the daughters of men, that it was a reference to angels or watchers or other spiritual beings. In other words, we had angels who left their abode, came down, and then took as wives human women. And you might ask, well, why would they want to do that in the first place? Well, it did say they were attractive. I mean, can you blame them? But another reason is, as usual, the Lord creates and evil distorts. The Lord wanted men and women to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, while evil and the work of the enemy would distort that by reducing human fruitfulness and introducing a twisted substitute. But I think there is another sinister plot at work here. You see, earlier in Genesis chapter 3, after Adam and Eve sinned, when the serpent successfully tempted both of them, the Lord told the enemy that his head was going to be crushed. This was a future event. At some point in the future, your head is going to be crushed, you're going to be defeated, you're going to be killed, and it will come from an offspring of the very woman that you tempted. From an offspring of Eve, and we know this as the Messiah, your head is going to be crushed. And so the enemy's tactic here could be that if I can send my angels or demons down to earth and distort and twist the bloodline, then the offspring of Eve, who's going to kill me one day, will never be born. And so we have 5 clusters of evidence that I want to share with you that these things in Genesis 6, verse 2, are in fact spiritual creatures of some sort. And here's the first one. I want you to consider the phrase sons of God. This exact wording only appears a few times in the Bible, and as you know, exact wording does matter. For instance, if I say I am a Christian and a scientist, that means one thing. If I say I'm a Christian scientist, those are totally different things, and the word order matters. So this phrase, sons of God, is very specific. It appears only a few times in the Bible. One of them is in Job chapter 1, 2, and 38. Now check this out. In the book of Job, Satan is wandering the earth with some of his cohorts, we might call them demons, and they enter into the presence of the Lord, and look what it says. Now there was a day when the sons of God, there's that phrase, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. So in this case, the phrase, sons of God, specifically is being used to describe heavenly creatures. Now, we move into chapter 2, same thing. Again, there was a day when there's that phrase, sons of God, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. So 2 times, exact phrase, sons of God, referencing spiritual creatures. Furthermore, when we continue in the book of Job, there was a time when God was challenging Job over his arrogance and asked him several rhetorical questions. This is in chapter 38. Here's what he says. He says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measures? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all," there it is, "the sons of God shouted for joy?" The Lord is referencing the creation of the foundations of the earth. And he says, "Job, where were you when I did this?" But what we find, and this is a detail, is that the morning stars, this is a reference to angels, and the sons of God were singing and shouting for joy. This is not a description of humans. Humans weren't created yet. This is day 2. And so once again, that phrase, the sons of God, refers to angelic-like creatures or spiritual creatures. Now, every time that phrase is used, it refers to a spiritual being. So that is one part of evidence. Here's one chunk of evidence. Here's the next one, and I would say the report on marriage. The narrator goes out of his way to report that these sons of God took wives. Now, this has already been happening for 1,600 years. It's almost like saying, "Hey, guys, the sun rose today." Well, of course it did, Captain Obvious. You don't report something unless it's out of the ordinary, like sons of God or angels came down and took wives and slept with them. So this would be worth reporting. Now, there is a counter-argument that comes from Matthew 22. And in Matthew 22, it says this. This is Jesus speaking to people when they go to heaven. He says, "For in the resurrection, they will neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." So Jesus says, when you get up into heaven, you're not going to be married, you'll be like the angels. And the implication is angels don't get married. And the implication, or at least as far as the argument is concerned, is that angels then are unable to reproduce physically, therefore it can't be referencing angels in this passage. But understand that Jesus is talking about, number one, angels that are in heaven, but these angels have left their dwelling place. But it also doesn't say that they can't have sexual relations. It just says that they're not, just as humans can, but in heaven they don't. So all this to say, Matthew 22 doesn't really dismantle this view. These are fallen angels who left heaven and had sexual relations with the daughters of men, and the result was, and this is our third bit of evidence, is that they had Nephilim offspring. Now, back to our passage, verse 4, it says, the daughters of men bore children to the sons of God. So you have these angelic beings, they get married to these women, they have children, and the result was the Nephilim, and they're described as mighty men of renown, and then later as terrible giants. So we'll unpack the nature of the Nephilim later, but for now, regular men sleeping with regular women is neither newsworthy, nor is it likely to produce Nephilim or giants. Now, one fourth bit of evidence comes from the early church fathers. And this is when historical theology is helpful. What we're saying is, if we believe this is true, what did the people before Jesus' day think about this? What did the people during Jesus' day think about this? What did the people in AD 500 think about this? And we can see bits of evidence. We have Philo, and he's referencing this story, and he refers to them as the angels of God. He says, the angels of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took unto themselves wives, all of whom they chose, those beings whom the philosophers call demons. Here's another one. This is from Josephus. He was an historian during the time of Jesus. He's referencing this same story. For many angels of God accompanied with women, and begat sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that was good, on account of the confidence they hid in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians call giants. So Josephus is looking back at Genesis 6, and he's saying, yeah, these were in fact angels. They had kids, and they were giants. And then later on, the Greeks talked about giants, and these are the same thing. He's connecting those. Now, I wish we could go through all of it, but we have other church fathers. We have Irenaeus, who makes comments about this. We have what's called a Clementine homily that speaks of this. We have the book of Jubilee that talks about this. And then, of course, we have the book of Enoch, chapter 7. Now, remember, these quotes are not scripture. My only point was to show that for thousands of years, both Jews and Christians interpreted Genesis 6 as the sons of God were, in fact, angelic or spiritual beings. Now, biblical scholar Gordon Wienham argued that the angel interpretation is at once the oldest view and that of most modern commentators. Now, one last piece of evidence, we have Old Testament parallels. And what I mean is that within this ancient world, there were other groups, pagan groups, that were outside of Judaism and outside of Christianity. As an example, we have a mythology of the antediluvian sages. These were sages that lived before the flood. They were called the Apkallu. And these sages or watchers were spiritual creatures, and guess what they did? They took human wives, slept with them, and then had offspring who were giants, wicked creatures who taught witchcraft and so on. Now, notice the exact similarity between Genesis chapter 6. And so what we're arguing is that this actually happened, and as civilization spread, each culture and group heard these stories, and then they had their own takes on them. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which describes a worldwide flood that took place around 2500 BC, which is coincidentally the exact same time as the Scripture describes it. But in the story, Gilgamesh is described as part God and part man. He's a hero of old, a man of renown, similar to the half-human, half-gods in Genesis 6. And then we have later stories, as I mentioned, from Greek mythology about the union of gods and women. Stories like, say, Heracles, which is his Greek name. His Latin name, Hercules, is more common. Well, his father was Zeus, his mother was a human woman, and he, like Genesis 6, was described as a renowned man, a hero of old. So all that to say that outside of the Judeo-Christian world, these stories spread, and they're reporting the same thing. Something that was heavenly came down, slept with women, had children who were giants. So our bit of evidence is like this. The phrase, the Son of Gods, the reporting on marriage, the Nephilim, the early church fathers, and Old Testament parallels. So this is going to be my view. This is the supernatural view. And if you take another one, that's okay. We can still be friends. But I'm just assuming here in this story that in verse 2, it's describing spiritual angelic beings who have come down to marry human women. Now, let's move on to verse 3. Because in verse 3, we read of 120 years. Now, traditionally, this passage was thought, 120 years where the Lord says your days are going to be numbered 120 years. And there's a debate here. Does this mean that the Lord is saying, you guys have 120 years before I flood the earth? Or is he talking about I'm reducing the lifespan from 900 to 120? And we talked about that last week. I think it's reducing the lifespan. And of course, right now, the world record for the longest human ever having lived that has been recorded by modern instruments was a woman in France. She lived to be 122. So it makes sense. So after the flood, the lifespan dropped, and so I'm taking this as a comment on the reduction of the lifespan. This brings us to verse 4, where Moses, or the narrator, then speaks of the Nephilim. So here we are, verse 4. Who are the Nephilim? Well, before we get into that, I want you to notice something that the author says. He says of the Nephilim, he says, in those days. And when a narrator says that, that lets you know that the narrator was not there at that time. And we discovered this at the beginning when we were studying the book of Genesis, that this story was compiled and written from an oral history and a written history by Moses. He compiled this big book called the Book of Moses. It was so big it required 5 scrolls, and likely the first scroll is what we know as Genesis. So in verse 4, the narrator wasn't there, but he's speaking of history, and this is what we know about the Nephilim so far, that they were the offspring of angelic beings and human women, that they were mighty men, and that they were men of renown. Now, if we look at the word etymology, the word Hebrew word Nephilim, it means either the fallen ones or giant. And so when this was translated into Greek and Latin, we get the word gigantes, where we get the word giant. Now, a curious thing is the root word of this word Nephilim is nephal, and it means to fall. And we can't make too much of this because root words don't actually make words. The common definition does. But it has this idea of to fall or to be fallen. And so it could mean that these giants were morally fallen. These were the fallen ones because they were morally fallen. But it could also mean that they were fallen in the sense that they fell upon people in battle. They were heroes of old, powerful men, and towering over people. And so when you fought them, they just kind of fell upon you and you died. And that was the last thing you remember. So they fell upon people. So here's our list. These Nephilim were offspring of angelic beings and human women. They were mighty men, men of renown, and giants. But if we take some of the extra biblical descriptions of these Nephilim and we add them to the list, they were demonic, they taught wickedness to their wives, and they were also cannibals. And so, we might ask this question, wow, so we had angels that left their proper domain, rebelled against the Lord, came down and did these things. Did the Lord respond in such a way? I mean, normally when something like this happens, you call the police, and the police respond. So what happened here? Well, Peter and Jude tells us very clearly what the Lord did. 2 Peter chapter 2, it says, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly." So Peter is speaking of this time and this place in the world, and he says that when these angels sinned, that they were cast into chains of gloomy darkness to be kept there. So that's what happened to these angels who did this. Now, Jude comes along, and he says something similar in Jude 6. And you might say, Jude 6, do we have a verse number? Well, Jude is just one chapter, so there's no chapter and verse. It's just Jude 6. He says, and the angels who did not stray within their own, who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So Jude says the same thing. You had these angels who were in their proper dwelling place. They had authority, but what did they do? They left that. They came down. They did this thing in Genesis chapter 6, and then the Lord cast them into gloomy darkness with chains. Of course, then we would ask, all right, so we know where the angels went. What happened to the offspring? What happened to these Nephilim? And this presents another issue. And these are two things with which we must contend. Because here's what Genesis chapter 7, verse 22 tells us. It says, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. So after the flood, outside of the people on the ark, everything that breathed air was dead. So the Nephilim must have died during the flood, and yet what do we have? Numbers chapter 13, some 1,000 years later. And there, the spies report, we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Enoch, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So this doesn't make any sense. The Nephilim were there before the flood. In fact, they were one of the causes of the flood, and then somehow 1,000 years after the flood, they're still there. What's going on? Well, there's logically only two options, and I'm going to walk you through them. The first option is that the Nephilim survived. One argument is that the Nephilim, because they were the offspring of angels and women, did not actually have the breath of life. They weren't fully biological, and so Genesis chapter 7 doesn't apply to them. So they survive for that reason. But that makes no sense. If the Lord is going to flood the world because of them and they didn't die, then what was the point of flooding the world? Another option is that these Nephilim survived through sheer strength. There's a story out of the Mishnah, which was a later Jewish writing, and in the story, the Nephilim, these were mighty men of renown, they actually clung to the side of the ark during the entire time and survived. So what about Genesis 7:22? Well, they would argue, that this is a general statement, that just about everything died, but there were exceptions. So these are options as to how the Nephilim survived. The problem we run into is that later on in the Bible, we have many descriptions of these Nephilim and giants. So anyway, the first option is that they survived, but the next logical option is that the reports were untrue or exaggerated. So the description of giants were actually a loose colloquial term. Like, for instance, if you meet someone who's really tall, you might refer to them as a giant, but you're not actually saying that they have the DNA of the Nephilim within them. You're just using it colloquially. So when they describe large people in the Old Testament after the flood, they're using the word Nephilim, but it's just kind of a general saying. Or another argument is that when the spies saw the Nephilim, they lied. They didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to face these tall cities. They didn't want to fight, so they said, there's Nephilim there. We can't fight them. But once again, this could be true, except that there are many descriptions of giants that descend from Nephilim in the Old Testament. We have the Raphaites, we have the Amorites, we have the lesser-known Zamzummim, and we even have the Anakim, which, curiously enough, when George Lucas was thinking of a name for an antagonist, he thought of this word Anakim, and he changed it to Anakin, because they are the fallen ones. I don't know, coincidence. But check this out. There was a king of Bashan. His name was Og, which is a cool name. That's like a very, Og. It's like Gronk or something, Like, if you think of, a hairy giant, Og just sounds perfect. Og was the king of Bashan. He was a Raphaite giant, a descendant of the Nephilim, and it says that his bed was 6 foot wide and 13.5 feet long. So in other words, if this was a colloquial term, if this was the spies were lying, there's too many instances of these giants in the Old Testament. So no. So if they didn't survive and the reports weren't true or exaggerated, there's only one more possibility, and that is that the Nephilim came back. So how did they come back? Well, one theory was that because they were so interspersed with the society, that Noah or one of his sons or daughters-in-laws had the DNA within them, and then kind of like the X-Men, they carried this gene, and every once in a while the gene flared up, and then you had a big giant. Another option, this is the one that I take. I know this is weird, but this is what we're dealing with. This is Genesis chapter 6. The last one is that a small contingent of angels once again decided to rebel and came down and did the same thing again. So, that is my take on this. You might say, well, are they still around today? Well, outside of the giant of Kandahar and Bigfoot, probably not. All right, this brings us to our last verse, verse 5. And regardless of what you believe on this, the message here is found in verse 5. This is the Lord's indictment on the earth. This was the Lord's rationale for flooding the earth. Angelic beings have come down. They've made it with human women. They've created this race of evil giants. And from here, this is what he says, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, in that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This is a strong statement. Great wickedness, every intention, only evil continually. You see, we struggle with this ourselves, where we have evil intentions, but usually our intentions aren't only evil, and they aren't only evil continually. You may have a really bad week, and you have really evil intentions for a week, and then you calm down a bit. But the wickedness here was so great that every intention was only evil all of the time. So regardless of what you take of the sons of God and the daughters of men and how you interpret it, the message of Genesis 6 is clear, that the earth was greatly depraved, it was greatly wicked, it was an immoral mess, and the Lord had to respond to it. So this is Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 5. What do we make of this? What's the lesson? Well, the first thing is that Genesis 6 teaches us about the depravity of humankind. I want you to notice first what we find in this story is sexual depravity. And if we go back to Genesis chapter 2, we find the Lord's ideal. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, the ideal for humankind is for one man to be married to one woman for life. That is how he created us. That is the ideal. It is towards this that we strive today. But guess what happens? We mess it up. Human beings mess it up. And 2 chapters later, we find that one man is now amassing multiple wives. We call it polygamy. So it's gone from the Lord's original plan, one man, woman for life, to guys gathering a harem and trying to sleep with as many women as they can. Has anything really changed? No, not really. But then we move into Genesis chapter 6, and we find a complete breakdown of sexual ethics where we now have angelic creatures who are crossing the boundary and now mating with these ladies. So there is rampant and massive sexual depravity in this culture. Now, I was listening to a political commentator some time back by the name of Michael Knowles, and I don't get my theology from him, but I was just listening to his comments, and he was saying that every time we as humans develop new technology, it ends up being used for disordered sexuality. So you have the printing press, we're going to have romantic stories in quotation, and we're going to have images being printed. And then we come up with stronger printing press with color and magazines, and what do we have? We're going to have images of sexual depravity. And then we develop film, and then we're going to have film of sexual depravity. And then we develop the internet and computers and phones, and it just keeps going and going and going. He was talking about this in the reference to robots. And he's saying, well, I already know what's going to happen. They're going to develop these robots, and we're also going to use these for sexual depravity. So all he was saying is that as human beings, we are naturally depraved, and left to our own, we are going to distort this gift that God has given us, like we see in Genesis chapter 6. But we also find violent depravity at work here. Remember in Genesis 4, the first human being born, Cain, committed a murder. And it wasn't just a murder, it was the murder of his own brother. It was a fratricide. And then by the middle of chapter 4, we find people celebrating revenge. And so what do we find? We find humans living together and going from revenge and to murder, and we see the society spinning out of control. And I will tell you that if you look across history, and I don't think there's a single exception, if you see societies that are breaking down into depravity and immorality, they will always have unmitigated violence, torture, and murder. Look at any of these big cases of the 20th century of Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and so on. It always comes down to the devaluation of human life. And this is why we talked about last week. We think that Enoch was taken out. And I also think this is going to explain next week why there was nobody else on the boat. And so in Genesis chapter 6, we have the utter depravity of humankind. We see sexual depravity. We see violent depravity. But then we also see spiritual depravity, where humans and angels are willingly coming together and cohabitating. And this is one of the dangers of passages like this, that we as human beings who have been given clear directions on spirituality will sometimes delve into this too deeply. Oh, I want to know about it, Bigfoot. I want to know about angels. I want to know about demons. And we can get trapped and get sucked into a wormhole of conspiracy when the Lord is only giving us this information to warn us. And in fact, there was a podcast maybe a few months ago on Alicia Childers' show that was talking about necromancy, and that is communicating with the dead. And she was saying that this starts off in a way that is very innocent, and it really has to do with grieving people. You see, you have a loved one that passes away. And like any other relationship, you would do anything to be able to talk with that person again. Maybe you visit their grave and maybe you talk to them, and that's fine. This is part of the grieving process. But then there are people who take it to the next step, who actually think, I can communicate with my loved one, and I think my loved one is trying to talk back to me. And why would you not want that? Why would you not want to hear from your loved one? And she even brought up examples of churches and pastors who were then actually saying and claiming that my loved one who's passed away is now speaking to me. But this goes directly against the Scripture. And so this is spiritual depravity. This is when we've broken these spiritual bounds that the Lord tells us not to break. Because we may think we're contacting a loved one, but I can assure you it's not. It would be a spirit of some sort that is trying to deceive you. So we see in Genesis 6 the utter depravity of humankind, but there is good news here, because when we step back and look at the story, Genesis 6 teaches us not about the utter depravity of humankind, but the utter grace of God. You see, the Lord gave grace to Cain after he committed a murder. The Lord gave grace to Enoch, who walked with God and pulled him out of the mess. God gave grace to the earth through Noah about this prophecy about how this son is going to bring relief to the earth. And then God gave grace to all the human beings in this world by sending a preacher to them to warn them of this flood. Look what Peter reports. And God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people. And what did Noah do with his life? He was a preacher of righteousness. That even as the world was spinning out of control, the Lord had men and women who called upon him in faith, and he sent out his missionaries to preach a life of faith and walking with the Lord and to warn them of the incoming destruction. You see, what the enemy wanted from this story was the enemy wanted to appear like a giant. He wanted to be mighty. He wanted to be well known. He wanted to be renowned. The enemy wanted the glory here by sending this world in depravity. And yet what we find is the grace of God towering above all of it. That he is giant in grace, giant in love, giant in mercy. That he is mighty, he is well renowned, he is the hero of this story. And what this means is that if you are in any of these things, this spiraling of culture in your personal life, there is a way out. You don't have to stay there. There is power to overcome. And if you are there and you've been pulled out, then there is also forgiveness and grace that you can be restored, you can be brought out, and like Noah and his family, then you also can be saved. So when we look at this story and we see the depravity and the evil and the wickedness, and the giants, just remember that the giant grace of God towers over the entire story. And that is our takeaway, that we don't have to live in this, we don't have to live this way, and that it is the God of grace who is in charge. When we call upon Him in faith, then we can be saved.